Hello, this is Cihan Alan from Hacettepe University, Department of Translation and Interpreting. First of all, I would like to express my gratitude to the team T&R6 and Professor Emine Bogenç Demirel for organizing this video conference in these tough days. The name of my paper is Sexuality in Retranslation, a comparative analysis on the Turkish retranslations of Lady Chatterley's Lover. As you all know, D.H. Lawrence's masterpiece has been investigated in a couple of decades by many translation scholars in Turkey. In this study, I handled the Turkish translations of the work within the scope of retranslation. Here you can find the content of this presentation. In their introduction to the book titled Language and Sexuality, Kulik and Cameron handle sex as a socially constructed concept, first by referring to its varying senses. According to the concise Oxford Dictionary, the entry for the word sex has 5 definitions. The first 3 of them refer basically to the male-female difference. However, the derivative sexual in the 4th and 5th senses does not simply denote the female and male distinction, rather signifies an erotic desire and practice, which actually forms a constructive basis for the concept of sexuality. Whether it is thought from a natural or cultural sense, sexuality is a discursive construction. In this way, sex as a taboo concept or regarding any explicit talk about sex as obscene is culturally motivated. Therefore, evaluating things and actions as obscene or taboo is based on moral values of societies. In this sense, obscenity is quite a subjective term. This subjectivity manifests itself through discourse in many forms, varying from not uttering any sexual word in a type of communication to censorship of so-called obscene literary works, as in the case of Lady Chatterley's Lover. It is the linguistic and cultural norms that determine the selection of text to be translated into a target system, as well as the strategies designed to translate them. The norms may not necessarily be a written list of rules formulated by a client or institution to be obeyed by the translator. They are rather frames of thoughts at a particular point in time in which meanings are shaped. In this way, sexuality discourses can either be made apparent or concealed through translation based on the norms of the receiving culture. Jose Santaemilia underscores the role of translations as a marker of translators' moral borders on sex, and further as an indicator of moral constructs of a society at a specific historical moment. Without any doubt, an added factor of retranslation enables one to see the possible changes or reconstructions of sexual discourses in the same community at different historical moments. From a post-structuralist standpoint, whatever the translator's limit of sexual morality, we cannot talk about the original work of the author anymore. Rather, the original is recreated by the translator through a rewriting process. For deconstructionists, language does not refer to things, as in the Saussurean signification process, but it refers to language itself. Therefore, there is an infinitely regressive signification in which one translated text is another translation of the earlier one. In our case, sexuality is reconstructed constantly with each translation. In a similar way, Foucault, who denies the notion of author as an ordinary identity, recommends to focus on the relationships of texts, be it a translation or not, and evaluates the discourse of a particular text within its historical conditions. Any kind of creation, say a translation for instance, is not the work of an individual, but a product of set of relations linked to the institutional systems of the time and place. Although Veneti does not reject the notion of source text in his remarks on retranslation, he considers the way retranslations are created in line with post-structuralism. According to him, a retranslator is aware of the competing interpretations embedded in the source text and previous translations of it, as well as the linguistic and cultural norms that give rise to these interpretations. For him, a retranslator may aim to maintain, revise, or displace norms and the institutions in which they are housed. That depends on the retranslator's intention to interpret the source according to a different set of values. The role of the commissioning institution cannot be overlooked in the analysis of retranslations, of course. The institution may impose a discursive strategy on the translator to enforce a particular ideology. Many publishing houses select source text to be retranslated according to their canonicity for commercial concerns. In such a situation, the ideology of commercialism governs the translation process and forces the translator to use a strategy to enhance the readability of the translation. For instance, such a readability can be thought to be achieved through toning down the so-called obscene elements in a novel. In line with the post-structuralist approach to translation, retranslations distinguish themselves from previous versions deliberately, building on the earlier interpretations. This distinctiveness is expected to be manifest in the discursive strategies. It should be reiterated that each retranslation reflects the historical situation at that moment, encompassing the cultural formation, values, and institutional ideologies. Veneti recommends foreignization strategy to achieve producing such competitive retranslations which confront and resist the dominating discourses of the target language and culture. This can be read in the translation of sexuality as a deliberate move from the discursive attempt to eliminate the sexual terms in the source text and come closer to the explicitness within the prevailing target discursive strategies and values. The aim of this present study is to analyze the Turkish retranslations of Lady Chatterley's Lover on the basis of the notion of translation as a resistance and post-structuralist translation theory, with reference to the earlier studies on the Turkish translations of the novel. The research questions to be answered are as follows. How sexuality is constructed or reconstructed, and what are the retranslator's choices in rendering sexual references? Do later retranslations of Lady Chatterley's Lover prove any resistance to the earlier translations, or do they merely reconstruct the prevailing individual or institutional discourses of sexuality? And the last question is related to the core theme of this conference. How can these retranslations be related to the mosaic analogy? The first version of Lady Chatterley's Lover was published in Italy in 1928 and smuggled into the United States. This version was an expurgated one. Then it was prosecuted officially in the USA until 1959 and the United Kingdom until 1960. After more than 30 years in the UK, it was published uncensored by Penguin Books in 1960. After the trial, Penguin Books allocated a dedication page in the first unexpurgated version of the novel for the jurors of the trial. Lawrence wrote Lady Chatterley's Lover in 3 versions. The novel was labeled as an erotic novel, and it dealt with extramarital love affair, and it was considered immoral and inconvenient in the USA and the UK. The novel actually portrays the industrialism in Britain between the two world wars and depicts the polarity of the village people and the manor people. Avni İnsel was the first person who translated Lady Chatterley's Lover in 1942. It was published by İnsel Publishing House and reprinted in 1945 and 1960. The version from which İnsel translated the masterpiece is a matter of question. As Akşit Göktürk states in his preface in 1982 translation, three versions of the original text published in 1928, 54, and 59 differed in content, evolving from a political stress into the delineation of human relations. Also, according to Ulaş Arslan, İnsel might have translated the work from an intermediary language, most possibly from French, since the versions in publication in France or Italy in 1940s were incomplete. Therefore, in this study, I have included the 1960 translation by Avni İnsel into the analysis. This translation is a lengthy one compared to the first translation. It was probably translated from the unexpurgated version of the novel, either from English or an intermediary language. Later on, the book was translated into Turkish by Akşit Göktürk in 1968. Akşit Göktürk reproduced his translation in 1982. 30 years later, in the new millennium, the work was retranslated by Meram Arvas in 2012 and Mehtap Gün Ayral in the same year. Later, it was retranslated by Meriç Selvi in 2013, Sena Büke Yılmaz in 2019, and finally Funda Torunlar in 2020. All translations were published by different publishing houses. Turkish translations and translatorial paratext of the masterpiece have been research data for many studies in Turkey. For instance, İşbua Erel analyzed the relationship between translator choices and socio-political conditions by which their positions are constrained in the case of translating taboo novels, including Lady Chatterley's Lover. In another study, Oktar and Kansu Yetkiner investigated the social and cognitive factors governing the translator's discourses in a diachronic way through a critical discourse analysis on the translator's prefaces. In her master thesis, Tanrıverdi Kaya described the linguistic strategies employed in the translation of sexual and social taboo references. In another master thesis, Arslan examined Avni İnsel's translation activities as a pattern and a translator between 2020s and 70s within the scope of subject of translations, obscenity, and censorship. Erkazancı Durmuş, on the other hand, questioned the potential reasons for standardization of heteroglossia and obscenity in the Turkish translations of the novel through an audience design perspective. Lastly, in a conference paper, Üstün Söz compared İnsel's and Göktürk's translations of the novel on the basis of Berman's retranslation hypothesis in terms of self-censorship. The analysis in this study is carried out based on the categorization of sexual discursive units. Therefore, I opted for handling the translation of references to sexual organs and sexual intercourse. The first and the second example include the word womb as a direct reference to the female sexual organ. And the first one, the original expression opening the womb to a man, bears in mind the concept of a woman's consent to have sexual intercourse with a man. Although the word womb is not an explicit slang term in English, only 3 translators preferred the words döl yatağı and rahim, which are commonly used in anatomical contexts. Insel, for instance, substituted the verb with the use of modulation, changing the perspective. In later translations, it can be observed that the expression was generalized without any reference to the sexual organ. In the second example, it can be seen that the translators are consistent in their choices to conceal the sexual discursive units and use sexually neutral terms in Turkish. Both words, dölyata and rahim, are used in Turkish as medical terms, although the former is more frequently used in technical contexts. Therefore, most of the translators' euphemistic choices indicate a compensatory markedness through another non-standard language. The word rahim, which has an Arabic origin, on the other hand, can be used in many other contexts. In some cases, it is rarely used as a slang term, but it was preferred only by Yılmaz and Torunlar. Also, different from other translators, Arvas and Yılmaz did not hesitate to use elaborate circumstantial elements that enhance the meaning. The way the four-letter words are rendered in Turkish is very representative of the translator's approaches. The C word and F word uttered by Mellers is part of his idiosyncratic language use, which is described as heteroglossia by Erkazancı Durmuş. As the translations in the table suggest, only Meram Arvas explicitly used the A word in Turkish, which is perceived as obscene and vulgar in the Turkish culture. By doing this, Arvas tried to level the loss of dialectal markedness, compensating it with vulgar language. Yılmaz also tended to use the word only with a censored alternative in print with a missing A letter. İnsel chose to substitute the word with an idiom, while Göktürk, Ayral, Selvi, and Torunlar omitted the whole part of the dialogue. The F word in the same dialogue, which can be handled under the category of sexual intercourse, was similarly censored by the translators. Only Arvas used two derivatives of the word as part of her general strategy to preserve the market language. The last example to this category is the male sexual organ. The word penis is uttered not by the characters but the narrator. In the earlier translations, the word was simply omitted, or as Göktürk did, substituted with an exophoric and vague reference. Among the three translators of 2012 and 2013 versions of the novel, only Arvas opted for using the word penis in its transferred form. Ayral and Selvi, on the other hand, generalized and substituted it with alternative subordinate terms or references. The latest translators of the novel did not abstain from using the term transferred originally. It should be noted that translators tend to transfer the linguistic units referring to bodily parts intact unless they are used as slang terms in Turkish. As for the references to sexual intercourse, the translators followed a similar strategy. The first example to this category is related to the concept of orgasm. Four translators did not want to use the word that evoked the sense of the action called upon with the phrasal verb come off in their translations. In the early translations, the source action was transformed into a general non-physical state of being through generalization. Ayral and Selvi followed the same strategy after decades, while within the same period of time, Arvas preferred the colloquial usage of the verb gelmek, that is to come in Turkish. Similarly, Yılmaz and Torunlar used another slang term, boşalmak, connoting to ejaculation or getting orgasm. Lastly, the piece of text on the present slide includes a different kind of reference to sexuality compared to previous examples. The repetitive use of some words, including alliteration and assonance, in the excerpt creates an image of a man and a woman making love in the reader's mind. The phonetic effect in the original was mostly lost in Insel's translation, since there is a shift from the plosive and fricative sounds, with accompanied omissions and substitutions at word and sentence level. This phonetic effect can partially be observed in Akşit Göktürk's translation by means of the repetitions and reduplications with plosive sounds. The words depicting the explicit scene, such as come into her, turget, and quiver, were generalized in the same translation, while the word orgasm was omitted. Conversely, Arvas tended to preserve the explicitness, choosing more direct references, transferring the word orgasm intact, and using repetitive plosive initial words. In Mehtap Gün Ayral's translation, repetition was limited to the verb dalga and its derivatives, and she omitted the word orgasm. Meriç Selvi was inspired by Ayral's translation. While this hampers creativity, it also copies any self-censorship of the former translator, which is a kind of reiteration of the repressive discourse. In later translations, the word choices are similar to Ayral's translation. They kept the word orgasm intact and limited the repetitive words to a single word, which results in a loss of the image of sexual intercourse created with the stylistic means. Having compared 8 translations of Lady Chatterley's Lover for the ways sexual discursive units are rendered, we can generally say that sexuality has been reconstructed, with some exceptions, within about 6 decades, based on the prevailing ideologies and conceptualizations about sexuality in the Turkish society. Arslan handled Avni İnsel as a patron who courageously introduced sex-related literary works into the Turkish repertoire. However, it can be stated that there is an incongruity between his motivations to translate Lady Chatterley's Lover and his translations, particularly of sex-related language. His translations can be evaluated as a visible effort in deciding what to translate, although he depletes the sources of the target language to disguise the distinctive so-called obscene elements, an effort which is consistent with the educational functions of his translations. Akşit Göktürk, on the other hand, reproduced the sex-related language in a blurred way, not making direct references to sexual organs or intercourse. Traces of resistance to these translations can also be observed in the analysis. Meram Arvas and partly Senabike Yılmaz's translations can be evaluated as a move away from the traditional reception of Lawrence's work in the Turkish culture as so-called obscene. It should be noted that within a year, there were 2 other translations when Arvas's translation was published in 2012. Ayral's and Selvi's translations conversely tended to censor the sexual references. Similarly, after Yılmaz's translation, which preserved the explicitness to some extent, Torunlar's translation, 1 year later, reconstructs the repressive discourse on sexuality in similar ways to Ayral's and Selvi's translations. In this respect, as Erkazancı Durmuş points, one cannot make a clear-cut explanation about retranslation dynamics in Turkey pertaining to the self or institutional censorship of sexuality. We cannot say that Turkish retranslations of Lady Chatterley's Lover were generally produced as a resistance to previous translations. In this context, Arvas's and Yılmaz's retranslations display temporal deconstructive function in the representation of sexuality. So why do we need so many translations of the novel reconstructing the repressive discourse on sexuality? The most possible answer to this question would be the commercial concerns of publishing houses. Earlier translations serve as a driving force to reproduce similar ones with the same readability. In this respect, only Arvas and partly Yılmaz can be said to have foreignized the novel for the Turkish audience compared to the previous translations. Do Turkish translations of Lady Chatterley's Lover form a mosaic then? The analysis on the retranslations of the novel shows that there is a normalized discourse on sexuality deliberately structured for reconstructing the repressive against the foreign. In analogy, translation of sex-related literary works into Turkish repertoire forms a mosaic short of color, in which almost every piece was neatly placed by each mosaicist, conforming in color and shape to the ones placed earlier, and only a few pieces become visible with their distinctive colors. Further details about this study can be found when it is published, but of course, I welcome any questions or comments through email. Thank you for your attention.